Hi guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a pivot table programmatically. This should be a pretty cool video. Before we get into it, go to excelvbasequel.com. You could watch right now almost 16 hours of videos for free. You could download the files that you see in all the videos. Put your email in here and you could get an email when new videos go up, and contact me here and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Okay, so let's get into this. So let's say we have two tabs here, one called data and one called pivot, and the pivot tab is blank. The data tab has some data on it, and our data is um, 4 columns, which first one contains a date, second one contains a name, third contains a product, and fourth contains a price. So imagine you work at a company and they sell products, all kinds of products, basketballs, phones, jackets, cars, whatever, everything. They sell everything. And there's prices for these products, and then people buy them and you record their name. So here's a date. On this date, these people bought these products at this price. And on the next day, these people bought these products at this price, and so on and so on. It goes down for, a lot of days, 12 days or so of data. So a great way to report this is to use a pivot table. And how do you do that? You just go to Insert up here, Pivot Table, and you go Pivot Table, and you could just click OK here. But what you're doing here now, you see how it highlighted this data range. It's saying choose the data that you want to analyze, and it's saying select table or range. 99% of the time, you're just going to click OK because it's going to select automatically the range that you want in your pivot table. So this is telling Excel, okay, I want to create a pivot table using this range from A1 to D57. Here's A1. Let me scroll down to D57 real quick. It's the last row. So as soon as you put your cursor in here, Excel can figure out, what the range should be, or the maximum number of rows that are used. So it sort of does that for you. So when we create our pivot table programmatically, we're going to have to do something similar. We're going to have to use a range of some sort. If we click OK, it'll create the pivot table, but notice there's two main things on this display. One of them is which range you want to use. The other one is choose where you want the pivot table to be placed. So it's saying, do you want it on this worksheet, existing worksheet, or a new worksheet? And I'm going to say existing worksheet. I'm going to go over here and I want to click on the pivot table tab. And I'm just going to click in A1. So now it says create pivot table on on the sheet pivot in range A1, and that's now I'm on the sheet called pivot. Put my cursor in range A1, and if I click OK, it'll now create the pivot table with this range of data, and it'll create it at this location on the pivot sheet, and it'll start in cell A1. So I click OK, and here's my pivot table. And then I can drag fields into this. I could put a date in the row field, and I could put a price in the value field. And here you see we have sort of the same, we have a pivot table that reports the sum of the price for every day. You could make it a little different by putting the product in the column like this, and now you get something that looks like this. Let me format this, center it. You get something that looks like this, that now for every day going down, you see what products were sold. Okay, so that's cool, but we had to do that all manually. So let's try to do that programmatically using VBA, and it's surprisingly pretty simple. And one more thing I want to show you is when you do pivot tables, you can do things with a calculated field. So in our case, we have this field called price. If I right click, I go to show field list, I see a field over here called price. If you want to create another field that isn't in here, you could do that with what's called a calculated field. And if you go up to the top bar and you go to options, you go to formulas and you go to calculated field, well, now I can do something called this. I could do like commission, and I could do the formula, and the formula is going to be, let's call it the price field times 10%. So that I'm basically creating a calculated field using the fields in this pivot table. So here are the fields in the pivot table. You could use them to create what's called a calculated field, which is basically a field that is not in your original data range. So let's do that. If I click OK here, I'm just going to get a field called commission. If I click add, now here, over here, you can see I have a field. I have a field called commission here. If I take out the sum of the price here, notice that these values are now the sum of commission. So real easily with pivot tables, they're super powerful. You can very easily structure data, with rows and columns like we did. But even you could do more than that. You could create calculated fields, and they're very flexible. So let's try to mimic this in VBA. Let's try to do this in VBA, including the calculated field. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear the contents here. And in order to delete the pivot table, I'm going to highlight all the rows that it lives in, and I'm going to press delete. Okay, so now I have a blank tab again, pivot. I just wanted to show you, the basics of the pivot table, and now we could start talking about how we're going to build it in VBA. So to do it in VBA, let's go to the Visual Basic Editor. So Developer tab, Visual Basic. I'm going to insert a module, and sub, I'm going to call it make a pivot table. And we know a couple things. We know that we're going to be working with pivot tables, so I'm going to put dim pt as pivot table. Now this is declaring a pivot table object. Remember, you're working with objects in VBA, so you could declare a pivot table object. That's what this is right here. Just as I could declare an integer, I'm declaring a pivot table object. Next thing I want to do is declare what's called the cache of the pivot table. And this is going to be declared as an object called pivot cache. Now what is this pivot cache object? This is the source. You could think of it as the source of the data that goes into your pivot table. So it's all the data that composes your pivot table and the fields and the items. It's basically the data that is composed of your pivot table. So I'm going to put this. This is the source data for the pivot table. Okay. Now we're also going to use the pivot fields in this subroutine. So I'm going to declare a pivot field called pf as pivot field, and then I'm going to do dim pi as pivot item. So if you're not familiar with these, basically a pivot field is what we were dragging into the row or column area. That's a pivot field. And a pivot item is an actual, in our case, these are pivot fields. We have 4 pivot fields that we could drag into the pivot table: date, name, product, and price. These are pivot fields. And within a pivot field, you have all the values, which are the pivot items. So you could think of this, if you look at it from a worksheet perspective, these are your pivot fields, and within each pivot field, you have these items. And these are all the items in the date column. So these would be all the pivot items in the date pivot field. Here's all the names in the name column. This is equivalent to all the pivot items in the name pivot field. So think of this as, here's your pivot field, here's your pivot items, and then here's another pivot field, and then here's your pivot items, and that's basically that. So now we could start to create our pivot table. So what I want to do, first of all, I want to say every time I run this macro, I want to look on the pivot tab. I want to look on this tab and say, if there's a pivot table, delete it. So to do that, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do sheets pivot dot select, and then I'm going to say this. I'm going to say active sheet dot pivot tables, and I know the name that I want to give my pivot table, so I'm going to do my pt dot table range 2 dot clear. Okay, so what is this all about? I am deleting any pivot table. I'm deleting the pivot table called my pt on this sheet. So basically, on this sheet, active sheet, and the active sheet is going to be the pivot sheet because I selected it here. On that sheet, look at the pivot type table objects on that sheet, and specifically look at the one called my pt, and then with the table range 2, clear it. Now what is table range 2? Table range 2 is basically your pivot table. It's everything. It's all your data fields, your pivot fields. It's your column headers, your labels, everything. So if you clear that, it basically deletes the pivot table. Okay, so we delete the pivot table. Now one thing is that what if it doesn't exist? Well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do on error resume next. So this on error resume next, what this is going to do is say that if this pivot table doesn't exist on this tab, it would throw an error. So if we run this now and I run this, I get an error. And that's because it says unable to get the pivot tables property of the worksheet class. That's because there is no pivot table on this sheet right now. It's just blank. But if I uncomment this and do on error resume next, it'll encounter that error, but it'll just keep going. It won't pop up a message box. So if I run it now, nothing happens. No message box popped up, and that's sort of what I want here in this case. So okay, now we clear the sheet of any previous pivot tables. Now we want to set the cache of the pivot table. And to do that, remember the cache is the data source. So I'm going to go to the sheets data dot select, and I'm going to set cache of pt equal to, now cache of pt right here, this variable is what I declared up here as a pivot cache object. And remember, it's the source of the data. And when you have an object, when you're dealing with an object, you have to use the keyword set when you want to assign it something. So I'm going to do set cache of pt is equal to active workbook dot pivot caches dot create, and now when you do create, it asks for some parameters. It says, okay, where is this coming from? Is it coming from an external database, or is it coming from external source, a database, an Excel database, an Excel pivot table, an Excel scenario? 99% of the time, you're going to be pulling from Excel worksheets. So that is going to fall into this Excel database. So you want Excel database here. And then it says, what is the source data? So for right now, I'm just going to do range A1 to, I think it was D57. I just remember that. So here is where you're telling it what range to use, A1 to D57. That is going to be, this, A1 to D57. Okay. And you want the type, remember, to be Excel database. Okay, once you do that, you want to create the pivot table. And to do that, we could do this. We could do sheets. And I'm just going to do pivot. So now we go to the sheet we want, and we do set PT. And remember, PT we declare as a pivot table object. We do set PT. We're going to assign it something. And we use set again because it's an object. You can't just do PT equal. Because it's an object, you have to use equal. If it was just an integer or a double or a date or a long, then you know that you don't need to use set. But for objects, you do. Okay, so we do set PT is equal to active sheet dot pivot tables dot add, and then you do cache of PT. Let's see if this pops up any parameter. Okay, it doesn't. The first parameter here is the cache of the pivot table that you want to add. The second one is going to be where do you want to add it. So I'm going to do range A1. And then the last one is going to be the name you want to give it. And I want to give it this name, my PT, because I know that's just the name I want. So here's where we are creating the pivot table. What does a pivot table consist of? Well, it consists of source data, and that's what this is. In Excel VBA, they call it a pivot cache, and we set that up here. We declared an object called pivot cache, and we did cache of PT. That's our pivot cache object, and then we assign that the source of our data right here. And once we have that, we can use it to create a pivot table by doing this: active sheet.pivottables.add. So in a sheet, pivot tables is a I believe it's a property of the active sheet object, and within that property there's a function that you can add. If you pass these parameters, you can add it. You can add a pivot table to this. Actually, this is a collection. I bet you this. Yeah, this is a collection. So if you're trying to figure out what are these dots and how is this working, this is at a deeper level, but it's worth to go into the tangent. Basically, this is saying on this sheet, this active sheet, there's a collection of pivot tables, and I want to add one to it. And to add one, you need to provide the source of the data here, the cache. You need to provide where do you want to put it, and you need to provide a name for it. And that's all it is. So now we created a pivot table right here. And if I run this now, let's see, I'll go here and I'm just going to run it. So if I select the sheet, right now I selected the sheet. If I do set PT equal to that, you can see here's my pivot table. I just created it. Okay, now I can stop this. And if I run it again, you'll notice I don't get any errors because I delete it. This subroutine deletes it, and then it's going to create it again. So it deletes the pivot table called mypt, and then it creates it again down here. Okay, so we created the pivot table. Now we want to put fields in it. So we're going to do put the fields in. And to do that, we do with PT. So you use a with statement, and we do end with. And then what you do, it's pretty easy. You do add the fields. So you can do add the fields, and you do dot pivot fields, and now you provide a name. So you could put the date. This is going to be the name of your pivot field, and then you do dot orientation is equal to. Now here's where you provide, is it an XL column or is it an XL row? So if I do this and I run it, the date field is going to go into the column field of the pivot table. So if I run it, you'll see what this means. So here's the column field, and the dates went into the column field, and you can see that. This is the pivot table. Those are all the dates, and there they go into the column field. In my case, I actually want this to be a row field because I want it to go or a vertical. And then for these other fields, let's talk about name. I'll put that in the column field. And what else do we have? We had products. And where do I want products? I'll throw the product into the column, into the row field. That's fine. And we had price. Now price is what we want to report on. So I'm going to make that Excel data field. So if I run this now, look what we have. We have our dates and our products as, let me try to show the field list and pull this over. Okay, well here's the field list, right? Here's our 4 fields, and this is what was programmatically set up. You know, we have a name in the column field, we have a date and a product in the row field, and the price is in the data field. This is the data field where the value is. And that's exactly what we specified in our code. You know, you could see that date and product are in the row field, name is in the column field, and the price is in the data field. So we set that up exactly like this. I mean, it was real easy. But there's a couple things that I don't like about this. You know, I don't like that this goes down. I want this to be like the classic pivot table view. So you could change some things about this, and I also want this to be formatted better. So let's do some things here. You could do this. You could do set the number formats. So I want my data field to have a certain format. So you do data body range dot number format, and then you do equal, and then you do dot 0.00. 0.00. So this is going to set the number format for these numbers in here in the data body field. So this is like the data body range. I'm sorry. This is the data body range that holds all the data. So if we run this now, now I get 243.00. And that's better because I like to see decimals and things like this. Next thing I want is I want to switch this to the classic pivot table view. And if you don't know what that is, you could go click on it, right click on it, and do value field settings, or actually no, you want to do pivot table options and display, and you could click this classic pivot table view, and it looks better. So if I click this, I'm going to get something. So let me click it. Pivot table options. If I click it, if I go to display and I click this, I like this view better because I like the date in its own column and then the products down here in the next column. So let me unclick it and programmatically show you how to do that. Did it refresh? Well, let me just run it again and it'll go back to normal. So when you run it, it doesn't default to the classic view. It defaults to this view. If you want to put it in the classic view, you do this. Go to classic view, and that's just a comment there, and you do row axis layout is equal to, or not equal to, you just do XL, and you have these different options. You know, one of these is the classic view, but the one of these is the classic view, and that one that is the classic view is a tabular row. So this is the one that'll bring you to the classic view versus the other two. And you could play around with the other two to see what those do. But right now I'm just going to do this. And if I run this now, you'll see that, okay, I got the classic view. and that's because of this line here, row axis layout. Okay, so now let's add a calculated field. So if I do this, let's put a comment in here, add calculated field. It's real easy. You just do dot calculated fields dot add, and then you provide the name of the field, of the calculated field, and I'm just going to do commission, and then you provide the formula, and you can see that it's asking for these parameters. The name, well, I'm going to call it commission, and what's the formula? You need an equal sign, and then you do price, and remember price is what's up here. It's the name of a field times 0.1. And if I do this now, if I run this now, notice that over here I have this thing called commission, and this is due to that calculated field line in VBA. So this line right here, it actually adds this commission field here. So VBA is powerful, and using pivot tables is powerful too, and combining them is really powerful because you can add calculated fields, you can change the layout, you can change the format of the body, and do all kinds of stuff. Now I just added this to show you how to add it. I'm not using it. If I wanted to use it, I could bring it down here, and I could do this, and now you would have sum of price, sum of commission in both your data value field. So this is where pivot tables are good, but it might get things might get crowded. You might need to change how this looks, or only include one of them in the data value field. But my point is that you can use these calculated fields in your pivot tables, and you could do it programmatically like this. So I'm going to comment this out for now, because I don't, but just I guess notice that what was the calculated field. In our code we did take the price, multiply it by 10%. If you go over here, this is the price column, this is the commission column. Here's the price of 112, here's your commission of 1120. So you see that it's working, right? Okay, so we know how to add calculated fields and get them into the data. Again, you could have this as a row field or a column field or whatever. So calculated fields are not hard. Okay, so that's our. So here's our pivot table. We set something up. We have our names going across the columns. We have our product going down. And yeah, that's basically it. That's our pivot table. Now let's do one more thing, is that show you how to do a page. Okay, let's say instead of having the name in the column, we want the name as a report filter, like this. So we want it to look like this. So how do we do that programmatically? Well, that's pretty simple. I'm just going to copy this name, and I'll comment this out for now. And to do that, to put it in the report filter, like you see over here, well, that's called Excel page field. So all you have to do is that, and if I run this, you can see that there it is. It looks exactly like what we want, and we used a page field. So there's 4 different types here. There's a row field, there's a column field, there's a page field, and there's a data field that you should be familiar with. Once you know that, then you're pretty much done. The next thing we want to do is say, okay, we programmatically created our pivot table. Now let's go one step further and say, let's put some default selections on these page items here. So let's do that. Let's go into our code, and this is sort of from another video. And to do that, here's where we're going to use our pivot fields. So I'm going to do set PF, remember we declared a pivot field object is equal to pt dot pivot fields, and I'll put name. And then you do a with statement. You do with pf and then end with. So now we have a field called name, and we want to loop through every name that's in that field. And that, remember what we said before, is that here's your pivot field called name. What are these called? Well, these are called pivot these are called pivot items. So we want to loop through all the pivot items in the pivot field name, and that's exactly what we're going to write. We're going to write for each pi, that's a pivot item, in pf or in pf dot pivot items, next pi. So this for loop is very intuitive. It's saying okay, I have this pivot field name. For each name in that field, do something. That's all it is. And what we want to do is say if pi dot name is equal to Bob, then pi dot visible is equal to true. Else pi dot visible is equal to false. And if. So we're going to loop through this name field, and if the name is Bob, then we're going to select it. And select it means, basically make it visible. When you're dealing with pivot items, if you say pi.visible, that means it's going to be selected. If you say pi.visible equals false, or I should say pi.visible equals true means it will be selected. Pi.visible means equals false means it won't. So if we run this, look what happened. It built us a pivot table programmatically with all the fields set up like we want, and there's a name in this name field, and there's Bob just hanging out. He's the only one selected. Okay, that's cool. Now can we go further? Yes, we could go further, and we could say Bob does phones and eyeglasses. He bought phones and eyeglasses. So we could just copy this, go down here and go set this equal to product, and then we could say if this equals phone, then true. So now we should see eyeglasses go away. And if I run this, eyeglasses, sure enough, it went away. Okay, so let's try to put Bob and Ann and Frank and see what happens, see what we get. So now we're going to do some filtering. If it equals Bob or Frank, or what was the other one? I'll just do Ed. And if I run this, you can see it's building the pivot table programmatically. Here's Bob, Ed, and Frank are selected. And let's try to put another OR statement in. Let's do let's take it out. Let's actually comment this out and see what we get. So I'm just going to comment this out just to show you, because I don't know what all those guys bought. So I'm just going to run it. Oh, this width I actually, yeah, I have to comment that out. Okay, so if I run this, there you go. Here's your name field. You got 3 guys selected, and here's what they all bought, and here's the dates. the sum of their purchases. And that's how you programmatically create a pivot table using VBA. And you could set different fields. So here, we set the name field, and here we set the product field. And you could set the date field or whatever field you want. It's super flexible. Like whatever you can do manually here, you can do it in VBA. So you saw how fast it was to build a pivot table using VBA, and so it's super powerful once you get this going. If you have lots of reports and things like that if you have lots of data to manipulate, code like this will really help you out, because you can create you could create a ton of reports really fast. Okay, so I'm just going to sum up this video. Remember, you're working with objects in Excel all the time, and there are pivot table objects, and in order to create a pivot table you need the source of the data, so you use pivot cache. In order to turn on certain items in certain fields, you use pivot fields and pivot items objects. You use those objects. Then basically here, to delete a pivot table, you use this pivot table 2 dot pivot uses table range 2 dot clear. And then to create a pivot table, you do active workbook pivot caches create, and then Excel database. This means you're going to pull the data from an Excel worksheet, and then the range of where you're coming from on that worksheet. Now this could be dynamic. This doesn't have to be A1 to D57. You could name a range here. So if I'm sorry to go on a tangent, but if I go in here and I name a range, if I go to name manager and I go new and I just put data, and then it's already selected. Oh, I could just do it here, A1 to D57. So if I name a range called data and close this, well then, instead of having it hard coded, I could name it. It's still going to be hard coded, but in some other, let's see. So now this will still work. Let me briefly talk about this data range. So I named it something, right? But what happens? Sorry to get on a tangent again, but what happens if another row is added down here? Well, this data range won't be dynamic. So what you can do, let me see if I remember the code, is if you go to this name manager and you just do this, if you do equals offset A1, comma 0, comma 0, comma count A, and then count A, you're gonna count down that column, and then count A, count across the top column. What's this? Comma 0. Let's see. Wow, it worked. Okay, so what this does, when you enter a name, it dynamically looks and finds the last row that is used. So if I scroll all the way down, you'll see A57, row 57 is selected over here. And that's cool because it is dynamically finding the last row that is used. It's dynamic. So that means if I close this and click close, if I run this, okay, it ran, cool. But now here's the cool part about using the named range, is that I can add something, 6, 13, 2011. I'll put Tom. I'll put that he bought a ship and it costs $300,000. So now watch what happens. If we go to this name manager, the offsetting of A1 and this name here, or this formula here, if you look at it, it automatically picked up that row that I just added. And that's super powerful because now you don't need to worry, okay, is it going to go down far enough? Do I have to go back and name the range? And is it going to be hard coded? So you really should use something like this, like a named range. I'll even put that here. Use named range. And I'll put dynamic. Okay, so if I run this again, let's search for Tom here. And there's Tom, and he's our piece of data that we just added. There's the 300,000 right there. Okay, so to wrap it up, use a dynamic range, create the pivot table like that, and then add your fields. You have 4 types: row fields, column fields, data fields. Do it like this: pivot fields, name of the field, and then dot orientation. And then turn on your fields. What fields do you want on? You set the name, the pi.name equal to something, and set visible true, visible false. And you could do that with multiple fields, as you saw that we did it with the name field and we did it with the product field. Okay, so that'll wrap up the video. What I'm going to do is take all that code and I'm going to put it on Excel VBA SQL.com. Like I said again, if you want to learn Excel VBA, this is the place to go. There's a ton of hours of free videos to watch. So put your email in here. I'll send you an email when a video goes up, and contact me here and I'll answer your questions. Until the next video, I'll talk to you later.